Continuing on with our lecture on public choice, we're going to discuss the next key insight, and that's government or bureaucracy is inefficiently large. And we'll also kind of talk about the incentives too and how they have the incentive to be inefficiently large. So if firms maximize profits and politicians maximize votes, bureaucrats maximize the size and budget of their agency or department. And this is because in the public sector, the absence of the profit and loss motive reduces the incentive of producers, in this case, the producers of bureaucratic outcomes and policies, to keep their costs low. There's not even a bankruptcy process that's capable of weeding out inefficient producers or bureaucrats. Public sector managers are seldom in a position to gain personally from measures that reduce costs. And because public officials and bureau managers spend other people's money, they have an incentive to be less cost conscious. In other words, efficiency has no constituency. And with command over more resources and more people and money, you get raises and promotions, your bureaucratic agency grows. Firms are successful if they're profitable, and politicians when they get their votes. But bureaucrats, if they're more visible and they're more powerful, well, that's a sign of success. And what was the most recent example of this? Well, probably the most recent example of this was the COVID pandemic and Dr. Anthony Fauci and health bureaucracies. I mean, an argument can be made that we put the livelihoods and decisions of individuals across the country into the hands of one single man, this guy. Now, maybe we wanted to do this. I'm not saying that lockdowns were necessarily good or necessarily bad. However, we have to think about the incentives that might be involved. And there was certainly an incentive of Dr. Fauci and health bureaucracies to kind of promote or encourage this idea that COVID was very dangerous and deadly and that we need to do what he said. I mean, after all, they gained a lot of power. And then this also created some incentives that trickled down throughout the bureaucracies and into the health sector. I mean, hospitals got massive bonuses if they had patients, right, that had COVID-19 or died from COVID. And this usually led to a lot of reporting on cases of COVID. And as we know, the tests weren't that effective right away. I mean, it took a while for those tests to stop producing false positives, but there was an incentive to report cases as positive. Again, we're not having the debate about whether or not there was lying or cheating involved or whether we should or should not have lockdowns, but we should think about the potential incentives at play. And there's an incentive to grow the health bureaucracy and power of these people in these positions. So in addition to being very big and bloated, bureaucracy is also incredibly inefficient. And this is because they just don't function via the price system. There's no profit and loss mechanism to tell them what projects or what production methods are good or bad. Like what tells them that resources are more or less scarce? Where do they direct their resources to the most productive use? And turns out that doesn't really matter to them. Profit and loss, it's non-existent in bureaucracies. Okay? A good example of this is the U.S. Forest Service. Okay, so their revenues do not depend on their productivity. What do I mean by that? Well, by law, budgets are not a constraint. I mean, this is literally written into federal law. They don't have to worry about budget constraints. And they don't have to choose projects because they're going to give them a great dollar return. In fact, that doesn't matter. Okay, if a private company or business thought this way, they would quickly go out of business. I mean, heck, if a CEO thought this way, I guarantee the shareholders would probably ditch them in a heartbeat. Okay? The Forest Service and other bureaucratic agencies, they operate in what's called baseline budgeting. So it just means use it or lose it. So if you don't use all of your money in a given year or given fiscal year, you're going to lose that money the next year. And so bureaucracies, like the Forest Service, have an incentive to overspend. But the problem is they don't spend on the most productive thing. They don't have profit and loss to tell them what is the most productive thing. They don't have profit and loss to tell them what's adding value to people or providing the needs to certain people. They just spend. And usually that leads to spending on wasteful resources, like hiring 5 people to do a job that 3 people can do, or more office space that just goes completely unused, or fancy government cars. I mean, you just have an incentive to spend. You're not rewarded for cutting your budget. And also, you're not responsible for any loss because Congress or the Treasury is just going to bail these agencies out. So there's no real incentive to care if you overspend or don't make a profit because you know Congress will pick up the tab. And if anything, Usually what that is used for is, hey, if we had a loss or we had a poor outcome, it's because we need more money. You need to spend more. I mean, we hear this all the time. We're not spending enough on education, for example. But education spending has been going up for decades, and outcomes have been stagnant, and in some cases, and across some demographics, has gone down in terms of performance. Okay? So it's not just about throwing money at it, but if you don't have a profit and loss mechanism to tell you how you're spending the money wisely, how do we expect to have productive outcomes or efficient outcomes? And we won't. We get inefficient results, and sometimes we could have very disastrous results. So if we think about the Forest Service, for example, what are some examples of this? Forest fires are an example of bureaucratic failure. In addition to the COVID-19 pandemic, 2020 was one of the worst years on record for forest fires in the United States. And forest fires originate a lot in federally owned land or forest. Part of the problem is they're very under-harvested. So they don't do a good job thinning forests. And in privately owned forests or state-owned forests or even Indian tribe forests, there's a strong incentive to thin your forest, keep it healthy, and keep the burn risk low. You keep trees further spread apart. Especially you remove dead trees, trees that are more likely to burn. And that's usually done through profit and loss mechanism. Well, how is that done through profit and loss mechanism? Well, remember, with federal bureaucracies, there's no incentive to keep costs low. So they spend on things that aren't productive. Well, it might be productive to thin forests appropriately, but if you don't have a profit loss mechanism telling you how to do that, you're not going to do that. Well, how does state-owned forests or Indian tribe-owned forests do that? Well, their forests are a key source of revenue for local schools, local healthcare options, and other things that help provide needs and goods and services to their communities. And so they harvest forests according to the profit and loss mechanism in ways that help them provide budgets for these other needs. And they kind of know, hey, we can direct our resources in this manner, trim down these trees, thin forests appropriately, that provide goods and resources to our constituents and keeps the forest healthy. In fact, they have a strong incentive to keep the forest healthy because they know it's a key source of funding, timber harvesting, for the needs of their citizens and constituents. So that was just a bit on the size and efficiency or inefficiency of bureaucracy. Next up, we're going to talk about voters and voter ignorance.